A quick explanation to those not familiar with either RWBY or Zenless Zone Zero. RWBY is an indie animation created in 2012 by Monty Oum and Rooster Teeth about girls loosely designed after fairy tales like Red Riding Hood and Snow White, joining a monster hunting academy and having cool fights with badass weapons. It's a thoroughly flawed production with enough problems to fill a book, but one that means a lot to me and its many fans. As of now, the series has gone into indefinite hiatus with the dissolution of Rooster Teeth and is now owned by VIZ Media, awaiting its new fate. Zenless Zone Zero is a 2022 game by RWBY, helmed by a fresh-faced game dev team, combining a bunch of early 2000s urban aesthetics with a modern art style with an energy similar to Fully Cooley or The World Ends With You. Being made by a newer team within RWBY, it escapes a lot of the trappings other RWBY games tend to fall into and has a refreshingly passionate indie-esque energy despite being from a big studio, and is my other source of obsessive brainrot currently. I've made it no secret that I find a lot of similarities between ZZZ and RWBY in terms of similar tropes and character elements, and I want to highlight how much a new incarnation of RWBY under VIZ Media can learn from this game. Whether they continue with Volume 10 or start fresh with a reboot, this is the golden opportunity to not just revitalize RWBY as a franchise, but evolve it into something better than before, something to match current standards and audiences. If you follow my posts and social media, you know I'm no stranger to lamenting the many things that RWBY could be, and how much of an uncut gem it is. Watching RWBY develop is like watching a childhood friend suffer from gifted kid syndrome. They showed so much promise in their early years, only to stumble around for the rest of their life, never truly carving the path they were meant to. This sentiment of mine is neither rational nor reasonable, but I've always felt that RWBY had the chops to stand among other great, highly popular and highly profitable anime franchises if it had played its cards right. I really believe that all this time RWBY, the same RWBY that impressed with the Red trailer over 10 years ago, had all the makings of success in its DNA. I'm not saying that RWBY built the foundations of 3D anime, nor that it was the first to do so, but to deny they had any impact at all in the incredibly small space it was in back then is disingenuous, especially when so many aspiring creators that would have seen and been inspired by the Red trailer would now be working in the industry as professional animators and developers. Some of them, like Dylan Gu's studio, even worked on RWBY itself. Why do people seek these fan works and other works that have that RWBY vibe to them, if not because the original no longer provided it? If you ask a regular anime fan, not a RWBY fanatic, not a terminally online Redditor or Twitter user, but a regular ass anime fan who watches Dragon Ball or Naruto, who knows about RWBY, and you ask them what they think about it, do you know what they would say? The most likely scenario is this: they would have been impressed by the fights and the animation in the trailers, decide to watch it, then either be turned off by Volume 1 immediately and stop, or they would find it interesting enough to continue, but probably lose interest in it past Volumes 3 or 4. Everything pervading the franchise of RWBY is fraught with caveats. It gets better in the later volumes, it falls off in the later volumes, it was never good in the first place. There's always a but when it comes to RWBY, a shadow that constantly follows it since Monty's death. To prevent this shadow from creeping up again, RWBY, should it ever return, needs to hit the ground with the right stride. And that brings me to Zenless Zone Zero. Since its very first trailers, ZZZ makes it incredibly clear the kind of energy you're meant to take from it, and more importantly, it carries that energy beyond the trailers and into the game itself. ZZZ has a core identity, a core thing it wants to be, and so far, it doesn't act like it has to be anything else. While yes, ZZZ has the benefit of unlimited funds via RWBY, and RWBY is a much smaller production by comparison, that is never an excuse when it comes to identity and knowing how to limit your ambition. RWBY games have all the funds to cover an entire world like Genshin Impact, or entire planet systems like Honkai Star Rail, but Zenless is set almost entirely within the scope of one city, New Eridu, along with smaller locations in its outskirts. The entirety of Zenless's explorable world is the RWBY equivalent of Vale and Mountain Glen. It's hard to imagine with RWBY given the existence of Mistral, Vacuo, and Atlas, but could you imagine RWBY if it was focused entirely on just Vale and Beacon Academy? How much more focused its story could have been, how much bloat it could have prevented. RWBY soared during its fight scenes, it soared in their trailers, it soared in players and pieces. In its many fan-made animations, show that it can soar with little more than high school hijinks punctuated by a satisfying fight every so often. Imagine if it had directed all of its resources and energy towards more of those, instead of pretending to be a world-spanning fantasy epic it had no business being, crafting thousands of 3D assets for regions and cities that you barely explore or immerse yourself into before they are destroyed, never to be seen again. Zenless, despite all the resources at its disposal, knows the value of restraint. It has a plot, but that plot is still within the confines of a single city. That may change in the near future as the story expands, but I too hope they don't get carried away by their own ambition and stretch themselves thin trying to make a full buffet when everyone was satisfied with just one unique signature dish. So the first two things new RWBY needs to learn from Zenless Zone Zero is identity and restraint. The third is sauce, aura, X factor, whatever new term you want to use, is the unapologetic desire to just make cool shit. The thing I love about Zenless Zone Zero is how cool everything in it is, how over-the-top anime aesthetics are baked into its DNA by design, something that RWBY very clearly lost as it transitioned from an earnest, if amateur attempt at a shonen battle anime to a slapstick Saturday morning cartoon multitasking as a Game of Thrones clone. This cool energy very clearly sapped away from RWBY over time, and it was sadly unavoidable. Miles and Carrie, despite their best of intentions, could never match RWBY's energy when their only exposure to anime is Cowboy Bebop, Gurren Lagann, and Avatar. Exceptionally good media on their own, yes, but also very acceptably Western anime. Marty was a hardcore otaku and a lover of Eastern culture, an unapologetic cosplayer, a DDR player, a fan of countless kung fu movies, someone who based RWBY's 3D models off MMD models and Adam's hairstyle off of Grimjow. You could not make something like RWBY without understanding the culture and tropes that inform all the crazy shit that makes it so unique. And through no fault of their own, RWBY's latter seasons would be helmed by creators who could not be from a more different world. A frat bro studio whose knowledge of Eastern media would have began and ended with Dragon Ball and weird Japanese game shows if RWBY didn't exist and Marty had to give them anime homework. In that sense, under Rooster Teeth, RWBY was always destined to lose that key part of itself. If nothing else, I am hopeful for VIZ Media's version of RWBY for that alone, being so familiar working with Shonen Jump and countless other manga and anime properties. RWBY should not have been looking to Avatar, Lord of the Rings, or Game of Thrones for cementing its identity. It should have been looking at these, at Fully Cooley, at Guilty Gear, at Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter. These may not be as well-crafted stories, or even story-focused at all, but they had that energy that was the lifeblood of RWBY's appeal. The delusion that RWBY had was thinking it needed to be more realistic and grounded to be good. It should have been the complete opposite direction. What was good for Avatar The Last Airbender was not what RWBY needed. The weapons should have gone bigger, the set pieces should have gone crazier. The animators should not have been the first people to get laid off every volume. They should have been the core team, holding stable positions in the company and polishing their craft. And at the heart of all this, the characters should have also been key. Zenless has a colorful cast of characters that feel larger than life and dramatic. Many of them also have deep and serious backstories, and true to shonen anime fashion, they feel like genuinely good, heroic people to be around. Much like the initial philosophy with RWBY's cast, they feel like standard archetypes at first, only to show hidden depths over time, but never feel like fundamentally different characters or lose any of their charismatic energy despite their trauma and hardships the way that many RWBY characters did over time. And of course, I really cannot emphasize this enough, they have the it factor. Their designs are wild, their weapons are crazy, and their fighting styles are flashy. I'm not kidding when I say that playing ZZZ or watching ZZZ media is like watching a spiritual successor to everything RWBY promised it would be, like experiencing an alternate timeline of its fate, a glimpse at what its second chance could look like. It is simultaneously over the top and flashy, while also emotionally earnest, with creative passion seeping through its every detail the same way early RWBY was. I look at Von Lycaon, Ben, and Ellen, and I imagine how creative faunus in RWBY could look like without any arbitrary world-building rules to limit their animal traits. I look at New Eridu, and I imagine how they could have poured all their effort into Vale as a living, breathing city. I look at Miyabi's combat, and I imagine how Adam, or even Blake's combat could have evolved to look as RWBY improved graphically each season. I look at the Hollows and the various bosses, and I imagine how truly present and diverse the Grim could have looked, and how much of a set piece fighting them could have been. I look at the wipeout screen, the chain attacks,
Ready.
Easy.
Great hit. Target confirmed.
the insanely satisfying parries, and the ultimate animations.
Haha! Just don't blink!
I'm here.
Is this how you know? There's more to battle! The glory! The pressure's on. Home is where the... Head is?
And I imagine what a RWBY that wasn't afraid to make combat its central identity would look like. I could only dream that VIZ Media's RWBY could look half as good as Zenless Zone Zero. Such funding and polish may not be possible, but that energy, that passion, that sheer confidence in what it wants to be is possible. It was always possible from the very first seconds of the Red trailer, and when you see such a spark from something, it's unmistakable, and it's worth every effort to make sure it's never lost.